A moment will come in your life when you will have to confront a very dark place. Either voluntarily or forced by circumstances, you will be pushed out of your comfort zone onto what Campbell called the road of adventure. And when you reach that road of adventure, you have to confront certain challenges, trials. There's a threshold, and usually in these, this is an even more complex layout of the hero journey, usually it involves a significant teacher, a person who sparks something in you by saying something that you might even have heard before in your life, but all of a sudden for the first time it penetrates and it gets through. So here's a breakdown for you. There's the ordinary world, the everyday world. And then there's the call to adventure, which involves the meeting of a mentor or a teacher. And there's the road of trials, usually comes in three. Think, for example, of Hanuman jumping over the ocean to the island of Lanka and has to face three challenges along the way. Usually things come in threes in these stories. Then there's a crossing of a threshold, meaning that the old world that's familiar is gone, and now you're entering terra incognita, someplace you've never been to before. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim describes the emotion that occurs at a moment like that as anomie. A-N-O-M-I-E. Anomie means that you don't know how to behave. The world you come from, you knew the rules there. You knew what was expected of you. All of a sudden you're in a place you don't know what to do, you don't know what to expect, and it's absolutely terrifying. And in that state of utter not knowing, you enter the darkest of dark places. It can be called, Campbell sometimes called it the belly of the whale, as in the case of Jonah. Jonah had no choice. He was either going to die there in the belly of the whale or he was going to do God's bidding. When you hit that point of no return, that point of no turning back, there's really only two choices. Either you transform and you embrace that challenge to become more than what you have been, or you die. Die can either be a physical death or it can be a psychic death by going back to what you were before, which is as good as dying. And if you embrace that opportunity, then you have a chance to what Campbell called achieve the boon. The boon is described in great myths as the princess who's being held in a tower, or a treasure that's being guarded in a cave by a dragon, or it's the golden fleece, or it's the Holy Grail, or it's the torch of knowledge. It's something that will transform the world. And those heroes who embark on this journey and who agree to embrace that moment have the option then of taking that light and bringing it back into society for the benefit of others. And that's called applying the boon, the application of the boon. So if you know these films are, I know we don't watch movies, but if by accident you ever saw any of these films, then you're familiar with the monomyth model. Hollywood loves the monomyth, absolutely adores the monomyth. Every one of these films follows this exact formula of embarking on the road to adventure, the trials, the crossing of the threshold, the mentor, etc., etc. And it's there in all the great stories. Study the life of Jesus. Now, it's not to compare the life of Jesus with a Hollywood film, but the life of Jesus conforms to this structure as well, as does the life of Buddha and the Prophet Muhammad. All went through a type of monomythic journey. If you've read Lord of the Rings, you've read an absolutely pristine monomyth model. It's there in Jason and the Golden Fleece, of course, in the Trials of Odysseus. It's there in the great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in Moby Dick, in Ahab's quest for the white whale, in the life of Joan of Arc, the rise of Joan from an obscure village peasant girl in medieval France to become the military leader who sought France's victory in its long-running war with England. It's there in the novel Jane Eyre, where Charlotte Bronte brings readers into the emotions and experiences of the title character, and we watch her growth into maturity and adulthood. That's also a kind of monomyth journey. It was there in the freedom marches back in the 60s and in the civil rights movement. I have a dream. Right? So what is this epic quest, if not the quest after a dream? So we intend to impose these hero-like expectations on our political leaders. Here is Obama Wan Kenobi, for example, with the healthcare lightsaber. And I was just wondering, I mean, if you take this model of the hero journey, does it apply to our Vedic texts? Does it apply to our story? So I went back into the Bhagavatam and Krishna book, and sure enough, reread the stories of Prahlad, of Dhruva, reread the stories of Narada, of Jadbharat, reread the life of the Pandavas, the lives of our Acharyas, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. You will find that they have all gone through this epic journey to truth and then bringing that truth back into the world. And it's been at great sacrifice. So instead of using this kind of politically surcharged word of sacrifice, what I found was that by talking about the hero journey, audiences responded more warmly to that. And for most of us here in this room, of course, the greatest of all monomyth hero journeys was initiation into Krishna consciousness. We've all experienced, as devotees, advancing in Krishna consciousness, that call to adventure and the stages of the ordeal. We've all experienced that in our own way. Campbell was fond of saying, this quote that has stayed with me, we must let go of the life we have planned so as to accept the one that is waiting for us. That's a big one. That's a big one right there. We all develop over the course of our life these expectations of what we will be and what life will hand us. And sometimes we even impose those expectations on Krishna. You know, if I chant my rounds and if I do this then for you, then this is what you got to do for me. I'm expecting this. And it doesn't work out that way. So I looked in the Bhagavad Gita and I found that there were these stages. I didn't want to, after all, quote a mythologist in trying to describe the life of Srila Prabhupada. But in the Gita you will find verses that refer to these same stages of the monomythic journey. There are verses where Krishna talks about how sacrifice must be performed. It's going to happen. It must be performed. And the giving up of a lower taste for a higher taste. And making progress along the way. And how if you stick to it, success is assured. And then his assurance, of course, that his devotee will never perish. So, and then ultimately, of course, the ultimate monomythic command, you know, stand and fight. That's a rallying call to embark on the monomythic journey, right there. You know, you don't think you can do it, but I'll tell you what, let me into your life, and then let's see what you're capable of doing. Right? So, there's one epic tale, of course, which embodies in the Sanskrit text the monomyth greater than any other, and that is the Ramayana. But here's what's interesting. Star Wars, which is the greatest contemporary monomythic film franchise, follows the script of Ramayana to the letter, to the absolute letter. And there's a reason for this. In the 1970s, the creator of the Star Wars films, George Lucas, invited mythologist Joe Campbell to live with him at his place, Lucas Ranch in California. And Campbell was telling Lucas stories of the Ramayana as Lucas was writing the scripts for the Star Wars films. So take a look at this, and you tell me what you think. In both stories, there is a dark lord who wants to take over the universe. He wants to conquer everything. And there is a beautiful princess whom the Dark Lord kidnaps. And the Dark Lord holds this princess captive in his special hideaway until a young hero sets out to find the princess and rescue her. And there is a wise teacher who instructs the prince how to use mystic weaponry that will help him to rescue the princess. And our hero is aided with the help of a monkey-like creature who helps the prince rescue the princess. And there's also a feisty older brother type person who helps the prince rescue the princess. And the hero wages a great battle against the Dark Lord and his forces of evil. And there are these giant things that they have to fight in this great battle. And they win with the help of an army of monkey and bear-like creatures. All right? And at the end of the battle, of course, there's a coronation, and the prince and princess return to their capital. There was a grand ceremony, and harmony is restored to the universe. Now, well, devotees would say that's the story of the Ramayana. Everybody else would say, well, that's Star Wars. So, just to give you a sense of how this hero journey model fits so well on top of our own great stories within the Vedic tradition. Here you see a picture of Joe Campbell on the right with George Lucas, who announced to the press that he had been influenced by Eastern myths, is the way he put it, in his writing of the Star Wars films. So now let's take a look at Srila Prabhupada's hero journey. It's return with me now to the early 1900s in India, right? We're in Calcutta, the capital city of British colonial India. That would be what we'd call in Campbell's terms the ordinary world. There are some European sympathizers to the Hindu culture, but the majority of British are looking down on their religions and looking down on their culture. What do you think was the main objection of the British to Hindu culture? What was their main, I'll make it easier for you, what were the missionaries most concerned about when they looked at Hinduism? The what? Culture. Specifically within that culture, within the religious culture of India. Yes. False gods, idol worship, deity worship, absolutely. That was the single, of all the things that the Europeans objected to when they arrived in India, deity worship they called the worst of all. One missionary wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Whatever plausible argument may be advanced for image worship, we believe if history teaches anything, it teaches that such worship materializes and debases the human mind, gives most unworthy views of God, and in the case of the vast majority, leads to a fetishism which in principle is identical with that of the most barbarous tribes. Till India rises above this idolatry, she will never have her proper place in the world." Which deity do you think the British objected to most? Krishna. In the words of British Supreme Court Judge Sir Joseph Arnold, and I quote again, "It is Krishna, the darling of 16,000 gopis, Krishna, the love hero, who tinges the whole system with a strain of carnal sensualism or strange transcendental lewdness." Right? So here's another quote from Reverend Alexander Duff. "Of all the systems of false religion ever fabricated by the perverse ingenuity of fallen man, Hinduism is surely the most stupendous." So this was the energy around Srila Prabhupada as he's growing up in India, that every authority in the country is trying to dissuade him from Krishna consciousness. He's not just hearing this from the Christian missionaries, he's hearing it from the government, he's hearing it from scientists, he's hearing it from reporters, journalists, historians. that this whole history that you people are following of worshiping Krishna is the single worst thing you can do if you ever want to take your place on a world stage. It was that intense. It was that severe. So now here's, of course, something that needs to be mentioned. That true bhakti culture, after Mahaprabhu's departure from the world, went into decline. So in large measure, what the British were responding to was the culture of the Sahajis and the Ganji smokers, and not the high philosophy of the Goswamis, but the perversions of the Sahajya sects, these deviant sects. So that has to be taken into consideration as well. Now what's interesting also is that the intellectuals, the religious leaders, most trained in Advaita philosophy, did not choose to defend Krishna worship. They did not choose to defend devotional culture. Their response was, we do want to make progress. We want to get some of the stuff that the Europeans and the Americans have. We want some of that, material goods. So what do we got to do? Let's cleanse out of our culture everything that the Europeans find objectionable. Let's basically get rid of Krishna. So you have people like Vivekananda. This is a quote. Images, crosses, and crescents are simply so many symbols to hang spiritual ideas on. Idolatry in India does not mean anything horrible. It is the attempt of undeveloped minds to grasp higher spiritual truths. So this is what's called, defaming by faint praise, condemning with faint praise. That don't make fun of those Krishna devotees that you're seeing. They're trying in their own way, but they're kind of neophyte. They're very backwards. So just be patient with them. Eventually they'll understand the true oneness that is the world religion, espoused in Vedanta. Radhakrishnan, the first vice president of India, in his commentary on Bhagavad Gita, and Prabhupada used to quote this in the early days in 1966 in order to show that Radhakrishnan was an impersonalist. The 9th chapter, verse 43, Krishna says, "Be mindful of me, with love offered to me, sacrificing for me, acting out of reverence for me, surely you shall come to me." Manmada bhava madbhakta, etc. Radhakrishna in his commentary says, it is not the personal Krishna to whom we have to give ourselves up utterly, but the unborn, beginningless, eternal, who speaks through Krishna. So this was the idea. Deny Krishna his identity as the Supreme Person. Move away from spiritual particularism, from the focus on a personal divinity. Get rid of everything that the missionaries and the intellectuals and the European cultures are finding objectionable. And let's move up to a higher plane of accepting that we are essentially all worshiping the same one. It was a strategy. And they had a purpose. Their purpose was to bring India out of its place as a third world nation, out of its vision in the eyes of the world as a barbarian heathen culture. And this was the only way they knew how, because they didn't have the training that Prabhupada had at the feet of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami. Right? All that the massive people in India could understand was they wanted independence. That was their shot at material prosperity. So of course any attempt at that was immediately put down with extreme violence by the British. So along comes Gandhi and says, first we get rid of the British, right? Then we'll get our act together spiritually. Right? And into this moment, when devotion to Krishna is teetering on the brink of extinction, comes a young man named Abhay Charan. His father, Gaur Mohan, is an Orthodox Chaitanya Vaishnava who was determined to see that his son would not succumb either to the materialistic influence of the West or the impersonalist distortions of the Mayavadis and the Bajraloka, which was the Bengali intellectual community. But he would formed this son, this one child, to grow up to become a true Radha Krishna Vaishnava. So from outward appearances, Abhay Charan was going to lead the life of a comfortable, middle-class Gaudiya Vaishnava. Now comes what we might call the call to adventure. In 1922, a friend introduces him to his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, the mentor in the monomyth chronology, who gives him his life mission: go to the West and teach the real message of Krishna culture, Krishna consciousness. Now here is a broader vision of the world than even Prabhupada's father had been able to give him. Up until that time, he had a vision of Vaishnav culture within the context of India. Here was someone who was broadening his horizons, saying, no, not India, but the entire world needs liberating. And it doesn't depend on first bringing Britain out of India. This was an awakening, an epiphany for him. In 1922, that meeting took place. And here at a 1935 meeting, you see Abhay Charan at the far right. This is when disciples of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati first returned from Europe. They had had some impact, but not a lot. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had spent huge sums of money sending them there. And he was very disappointed. And days before he passed away, he retreats to a place to pass away quietly, and yet he writes a letter to his student, Abhay Charan, now known as Bhaktivedanta, not quite yet Bhaktivedanta, Abhay Charan Prabhu, Abhay Charananda, Charanaravinda. You kindly take this message seriously, the instruction I've given you, and take this to the West. Well, at that time, Prabhupada is contending with a family that does not share his enthusiasm for a world mission. I got to talk to Prabhupada's son, researching and doing interviews for Swami in a Strange Land. And Vrindavan Chandra Day was very gracious and generous with his remembrances. And he says that his brothers and sisters were quite bitter about, after all, he was their father. You know, who wants to see, do you want to see your father leave home? I mean, what young person would not have an emotional response to that situation? They didn't think in terms of, oh, he's going to go to bring Krishna to the world. The only thing they could see was, he's leaving us here alone. So they felt quite abandoned by that. And there's a whole section in the book where I've had to deal with it. You can't just skip over that. You can't, yeah, well, he was called by Krishna. You know, that's not very satisfying. Of the many people I showed the manuscript for this biography to, the one uniform concern they all had was, how could he leave his family? How could he do that? So I had to deal with it at some length. So the challenges were quite great. He had a family who was not supportive of his mission. His business was not doing well. He tried to form a project in India called the League of Devotees. That didn't work. He lost the property. Right? And in many dreams, his late spiritual master is saying to him, become a sannyasi. You must take this seriously. You have to do this. You must do this. Follow my order now. And finally, that's what we might call crossing the threshold. Right? The world is not going to be the same anymore. You know, sannyasi is social death. You know, you're no longer a part of the rest of the world. So finally, with the blessings of his godbrothers, in 1959, he becomes a sannyasi. You see him there on the right. And he lived in dire poverty. He gave up essentially any means of... He tried. He tried desperately to continue something that would earn some money. I mean, after all, who leaves India to go to the West, in particular America, without any money? You're going to starve to death. How are you going to make an impact if you're just a pauper, a beggar? Who's going to listen to you? So he tried every possible way until it just became clear Krishna had a different plan in mind. So here we have from that belly of the whale crossing over the ocean, literally a moving into a land of supernatural wonders and horrors. You have to imagine what it was like for him. This was a gentleman. This was someone who was raised in a very religious family, for whom women were honored, the flower of human culture. And he comes to New York, the women are all wearing mini skirts and all stuff going on. Had no place to stay. He's walking the streets. There's one very poignant moment that first winter in New York where he's sitting in a park chanting on his beads, and a postman on his lunchtime off comes and sits down. It's snowing. It's the worst winter in 50 years in New York. The snowdrifts were 6 feet high up against the sides of the buildings. And the postman looks and sees that this elderly gentleman has white rubber shoes on. He's not exactly dressed against the cold. And says, I'm a postman. What's your situation? And Prabhupada looks at him, and sensing that he may be taking some pity on him, he holds up his beads and he says, I'm never alone. And he says, in fact, there are temples, many, many temples all over the world, temples and books. And the postman's looking at him like, is he crazy? What is he talking? These temples are there now. And Prabhupada said, well, time only separates us. He said, I'm a patient man. So the story is well known that some young people, the Greenwich Village hippies were not like the San Francisco hippies. New York hippies didn't wear flowers in their hair. The New York hippies were activists. They were intellectuals. They knew philosophy. They were ready to, join the freedom movement. They were spiritual activists. And so here comes someone giving knowledge, real knowledge, substantial knowledge, and gradually, around him forms this young group of sincere, naive, but sincere young people. And what Campbell would call achieving the boon, maybe we would call achieving the book. Prabhupada would rise very early in the morning, and he knew that if he could establish a library of books describing the theology and the background to Krishna culture, that no matter when he had to go, because he didn't know how long he had, he was always talking about it. I could go at any time. I'm an old man. I'm an old fool. I could go at any time. He really did not know how long he had. Had to live. That he wrote summaries. The Krishna book is a summary of the 10th canto Srimad Bhagavatam. Prabhupada said, I don't want to die before my students have seen Krishna's face. The 10th canto of Bhagavatam is compared to the face, the smiling face of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So he wrote that summary for us so that we would know Krishna. And then he wanted us to have also the life of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He calculated there's 17,000 verses in Chaitanya Charitamrita. To translate all those verses, is it 17,000? No, 11,000. It would take another how many volumes? So he wrote Teachings of Lord Chaitanya, so that we would at least have a summary of the life and teachings of Mahaprabhu. I found this illustration in an old Back to Godhead magazine. Down there it says 1966, 1,000 magazines or something, and then you see the numbers going up and up and up, so that by 1977, 13 million books had been, books and magazines had been distributed. And this was a 1977 BTG, so they didn't know what was going to happen next year. Big question mark up there. So then, of course, Prabhupada returns to India with his disciples, okay, bringing the boon back. Right?